At 7:55, on a peaceful Sunday morning, hell opened up over paradise. In just over 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were killed. Sailors, soldiers, Marines, and 68 civilians. Another 1,178 people were wounded. In the harbor, 21 U.S. Navy ships were sunk or badly damaged. On the airfields, 188 aircraft were destroyed, many before they could even take off. This was the attack on Pearl Harbor, a perfectly planned surprise attack that changed the world forever. But how did it happen? How could an entire fleet be wiped out in broad daylight? And how did a series of critical warnings just hours before get completely ignored? Today, we are going to unpack the minute-by-minute story of the attack, from the secret weapons that made it possible to the final, terrifying moments on Battleship Row. The clock is ticking. Japan was stuck. It was already in a brutal war trying to conquer China, but it had no oil of its own. It needed oil from Southeast Asia, but the U.S. Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, stood in the way. Peace talks in Washington, D.C. were going nowhere. Japan refused to leave China, and America refused to sell any more oil. So, with their nation's lifeblood draining away, they turned to a man with an impossible idea. His name was Admiral Yamamoto. He was the commander of Japan's fleet, and he had a terrifying plan, something he had been working on since January 1941. He would not attack the US where they were strong. He would attack them where they were comfortable. He planned to sail a massive fleet in total secrecy and wipe out the entire US Pacific Fleet in a single morning. But there was one giant problem. Pearl Harbor is a shallow port, only about 45 feet deep. Everyone knew that when you drop a torpedo from a plane, it plunges deep, more than 90 feet, before it levels out. In Pearl Harbor, they would just get stuck in the mud. American commanders knew this, and they felt safe, believing a torpedo attack was impossible. They didn't know the Japanese had built a secret weapon. For months, their engineers worked on the Type 91 torpedo. Their solution was simple but brilliant. They attached small wooden fins to the back and wooden sheaths to the sides. These wooden fins acted like airplane wings, helping the torpedo glide in the water, and they would break off on impact. This one tiny invention, these Thunderfish, made the impossible attack possible, the silent fleet. The torpedoes were ready. The plan was set. Now they just had to get there. The strike force was called the Kido Butai, the Mobile Force. It was the most powerful aircraft carrier force the world had ever seen. 6 carriers in all: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. They carried over 400 airplanes. On November 26, 1941, this massive fleet slipped out of a secret foggy bay in northern Japan. For the 3,500-mile journey, they had one critical order: complete and total radio silence. They took a stormy northern route to avoid all shipping lanes. They had to refuel their giant ships in rough seas. If any other ship saw them, the entire mission would be aborted. For 11 days, they were a ghost fleet, steaming toward Hawaii, totally invisible. As the Kido Butai sailed through the freezing northern Pacific, 3,500 miles away on Oahu, it was just another beautiful Saturday night. December 6, 1941 was payday, and the island was relaxed. Thousands of sailors and soldiers were on leave, filling the bars and clubs in Honolulu. At Hickam Field, there was an annual charity dance. On the naval base itself, at Block Arena, a Battle of Music band competition was being held. Bands from the USS Pennsylvania and USS Tennessee played for a packed crowd. In the audience were several members of the USS Arizona's band. They were favorites to win the final competition, and they were there that night to check out the other bands. Later that night, an Army general driving home from a party looked at all the ships lit up in the harbor. He turned to his wife and said what a target they would make. The broken chain of warnings. How could this happen? How could an entire fleet, 353 planes in all, sneak up on the most powerful base in the world? The truth is, the Americans were warned, not once, but 4 times. The first warning came from Washington, D.C. For months, U.S. codebreakers had been reading Japan's most secret diplomatic messages. The program was codenamed Magic. On Saturday, December 6th, they intercepted a 14-part message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy. At 5 a.m. on Sunday morning, December 7th, the last part came through. The message was clear. It is impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations. This was a declaration of war, but here is the fatal mistake. The US had broken the diplomatic code, not the naval code. The Japanese Navy had been silent, so the US knew that war was coming, but they had no idea where or when. A warning was sent to Pearl Harbor, but it was not marked as urgent. It was sent by a commercial telegraph and wouldn't arrive until hours later, after the attack was already over. That warning was stuck in Washington. But on the waters around Pearl Harbor itself, the first physical clues were appearing. At 3:42 a.m., in the total darkness, a small minesweeper called the USS Condor was patrolling the harbor entrance. An officer on the bridge saw something, a white feather wake in the water. It was a periscope inside the restricted zone. The Condor flashed a signal to a nearby destroyer, the USS Ward. The Ward searched for over an hour, but found nothing. The first warning was gone, but the midget sub was still there, and it was about to reappear. At 6:45 a.m., just as the sun was rising, a U.S. patrol plane spotted the submarine again and dropped a smoke marker. This time, the USS Ward saw it clearly. It was a Japanese midget submarine trying to sneak into the harbor. The Ward's captain, William Outerbridge, gave the order to fire. The Ward's gun crew fired the first American shot of World War II. The shell hit the sub's conning tower, and the Ward dropped depth charges to finish it. At 6:53 a.m., the Ward sent a coded message to headquarters. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine." This was it. A confirmed enemy submarine sunk at the mouth of the harbor an hour before sunrise. But the alarm never sounded. Why? Because the commanders on base were expecting sabotage, or maybe a lone submarine. They simply could not imagine that this was the opening move of a massive air attack. The report was discounted, and just as that physical warning was being ignored, a final technological warning appeared in the sky. At a new radar station at Apana Point on the North Shore, two Army privates, Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, were practicing with the new equipment. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m., but at 7:02 a.m., their screen suddenly lit up with the most sizable return echo they had ever observed. It was a massive blob, a huge formation of planes 137 miles to the north. They called the information center at Fort Shafter. The call was answered by Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. He looked at the report, but he knew a flight of American B-17 bombers was scheduled to arrive from California that morning. He assumed that's what the radar was seeing. He told the privates, "Don't worry about it." Later investigations showed Lieutenant Tyler had been given the job with almost no training. The two privates kept watching the screen. 7:15 a.m. The planes were 92 miles out. 7:39 a.m. The signal was lost, hidden by the island's own mountains. The 183 planes of the first wave were now just minutes away. Tora, Tora, Tora! At 7:48 a.m., the Japanese pilots saw their target. Below them, the harbor was quiet. The American fleet was asleep. The lead pilot, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, grabbed his radio and sent the code word, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" It meant tiger, tiger, tiger! It was the signal that they had achieved complete surprise. The first planes didn't go for the ships. They went for the airfields. Their goal was to make sure no American planes could get in the air to fight back. At Wheeler Field, American P-40 and P-36 fighters were parked perfectly in rows, wingtip to wingtip. This made them easy to guard from sabotage, but it also made them a perfect target for an air raid. Japanese planes dove, strafing the planes, hangars, and barracks. On Ford Island, in the middle of the harbor, the first bombs hit. A radio operator sent out the first frantic message to the outside world. Air raid, Pearl Harbor, this is no drill, but the bombs were a distraction. The real killers were already lining up, flying low over the water. Their target, Battleship Row. At 7:56 a.m., the first of those special wooden-finned torpedoes slammed into the side of the USS Oklahoma. She was moored outboard, completely exposed. A second torpedo hit, then a third, and a fourth. The ship was an older design and was not built to withstand this. In total, as many as 9 torpedoes ripped her open, the ship listed violently. In less than 12 minutes, the massive battleship rolled completely upside down, her masts stuck in the mud. Hundreds of men were trapped inside, in pitch-black upside-down rooms as water flooded in. 429 sailors and Marines died. The Oklahoma became a rolling tomb. In 12 minutes, the Oklahoma was gone. But the single most devastating moment of the entire attack was still to come. At 8:10 a.m., high-level bombers were targeting the USS Arizona. The ship was hit by several bombs, but one was different. It was a 1,756-pound armor-piercing shell converted into a bomb. It struck near Turret 2, punched right through the armored deck, and detonated inside the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was instant and unbelievable. The entire front of the battleship was obliterated, lifting the 33,000-ton ship out of the water. 1,177 sailors and Marines were killed in that 1 second. It was the deadliest moment in U.S. naval history. Killed with them were all 21 members of the ship's band, Navy Band Unit 22. The night before, they had been listening to the Battle of Music. That morning, they were at their battle stations in the ammunition hold when the bomb hit. They were all killed instantly. The bands they were supposed to compete against later voted to give the trophy to them. The men on the Arizona never knew what hit them, and as the smoke cleared, the Japanese pilots looked for new targets. An hour later, at 8:54 a.m., the second wave of 163 Japanese aircraft arrived. They were met by a sky full of anti-aircraft fire, but they continued the attack, bombing the USS Pennsylvania in dry dock and causing the USS Shore to explode in a giant fireball, the fight for life. By 10 a.m., it was over. The last Japanese planes turned back to their carriers, leaving behind a harbor that looked like hell. The water was covered in a thick layer of oil, much of it on fire. In the hell they left behind, the survivors had to fight for their lives, and some became heroes. Aboard the USS West Virginia, which had been hit by 9 torpedoes and was sinking, was a sailor named Doris Dory Miller. He was a mess attendant, second class. In the segregated Navy of 1941, this meant he was a cook and a cleaner, and he was not trained to fire a gun. When the attack started, his captain was hit by shrapnel. Miller helped carry his mortally wounded captain to safety. Then, with no training, he ran to a .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun and started firing at the Japanese planes, firing for 15 minutes until he was out of ammunition. He was one of the last 3 men to leave the sinking ship. For his actions, Dory Miller became the first Black American in history to be awarded the Navy Cross. Nearby, the Oklahoma was still upside down, but from deep inside the hull, rescuers could hear the sound of frenetic tapping. Men were alive, trapped inside. A civilian shipyard worker named Julio de Castro organized a rescue team. For the next 2 days, they risked their own lives, climbing onto the slippery hull with cutting torches, cutting holes into the ship's bottom while fires burned around them. They saved 32 men from the darkness. These men were heroes, but they were surrounded by a level of destruction that was hard to understand. When the smoke cleared, the cost was staggering. 2,403 Americans were dead. That included 2,008 from the Navy, 218 from the Army, and 109 Marines. 68 civilians were also killed. And here is one of the attack's final tragedies. Many of those civilians were not killed by Japanese bombs. They were killed by friendly fire. The American anti-aircraft shells firing at the planes were failing to explode in the air. They fell back to Earth, landing in Honolulu and other civilian areas, where they finally exploded. But more powerful than the grief was a new sudden feeling: fear. The attack was over, but everyone was terrified that the Japanese were coming back, this time to invade. False reports spread like wildfire, with radio stations reporting Japanese paratroopers landing in the hills. The island was immediately put under a total blackout. Beaches were wrapped in barbed wire. The paradise of December 6th was gone, but they never came. The Japanese never planned to invade Hawaii. They only wanted to cripple the fleet so they could take the oil in Southeast Asia. Admiral Nagumo worried about the American carriers that were missing, turned his fleet for home. The Japanese had lost only 29 planes and 64 men. They had sunk or damaged 21 American ships, but they had missed the repair shops, the submarine base, and most importantly, the oil tanks. And all 3 American aircraft carriers were out at sea on missions and escaped without a scratch. Those carriers would soon get their revenge. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would ask Congress to declare war, calling December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a stunning tactical victory for Japan. But in the end, Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned it, had been right to worry. He had, in his own words, awakened a sleeping giant. The fear that gripped Oahu that day turned into a wave of American fury that would not stop until the end of World War II. The 120 minutes of fire on December the 7th didn't win the war for Japan. They sealed its fate.